We're going to start a summer series. I'm actually not going to get too far into the text today. Brad and I will probably switch off over the next few weeks. Jim Carlson will be coming in for the latter part. We're going to do 1st and 2nd Thess. And there may be a couple of other guest speakers, but this is where we're going to be for the summer. So if you want to read ahead or read some background into these two books, they're two little epistles, really, about 8 short chapters. Depending on how you date the New Testament, they are either the first or second book that Paul wrote, all right? Probably predating that would be James, maybe in the 40s. These were probably written around 50, 51 AD. So we're talking 20 years after the crucifixion of our Lord. Paul is on his second missionary journey. He's already cycled part of the globe with Barnabas and John Mark. He's gotten back and resent out. He's got Silas with him, and they pick up Timothy on the way. And so that's kind of the setting. And what I'm going to do today, it's more teaching than preaching today. I'm going to share with you the background of the books, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, by going backwards to Acts 17. And so we're going to read the text from Acts 17, and this is during the second missionary journey when Paul is traveling with his companions. And let's just see, this is the background of 1st Thessalonians as well as 2nd. But let's read through the text together. Acts 17, starting at the beginning of the chapter. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus who I proclaim to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could, hold on, y'all yell at me if that gets behind. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." And the people in the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. And thus saith the word of God. So if you get from the big picture, Genesis to Revelation, the 66 books that we have of our Bible, the Old Testament with the 5 Pentateuch books pushing towards a Messiah. As soon as the fall came in Genesis 3, God steps into that mess and he says, hey, I've already got a solution for this. There's going to be one coming. The whole Old Testament points to this Messiah, this anointed one who's going to come and save the world. The Jews totally believed this. They believed that there would be one who would come and reinstate Israel to its higher status and become their king. And so the Old Testament looked forward to Jesus. Then you had the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that come in, and they give the testimony of the birth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of that Messiah. He has come. But many of Israel don't believe. And with that, there's kind of a pause button pushed. And this new formation of this new people of God called the church comes out. In Acts 2, we see that at Pentecost, which isn't today. I think today may be Pentecost Sunday. And so Acts 2, we see the formation of this new body of believers. And it's interesting because where it used to be kind of a closed company of blood-related people that could proselytize, but you'll see this in the text today, people could become God-fearers, or they could come in and receive, but now it mattered not. You could come from any language, any ethnic, anywhere on the globe and become his people. It was supposed to be that way all along, but in one of the ways that I think the Jews failed was in purporting that and spreading that out. But here we are. And so after the death and resurrection of the Lord, the apostles take on their authority to spread the word, to go and make disciples. And what Paul does is he comes to Christ through a very extraordinary means. If you remember his biography, he was persecuting, killing Christians. You see it in Acts 8 with the stoning of Stephen, where he's there as the judge holding the robes of the guys who go and throw the stones. And I imagine that this probably helped out in Acts 9 when Paul comes to Christ, that he's watching Stephen, and as these stones are flying at him, as he's dying before Paul's very eyes, he's looking up and he says, "I see the living Lord." And Paul watches this. Paul was trained by Gamaliel, which is a big deal. That's like going to Harvard. Paul had all this forward momentum. He was probably one of the youngest Pharisees ever. He was leading in zeal. He was bringing in those that he thought were against and hated by God because they told of this way, where Jesus said, "I am the truth. I am the way." But then in Acts 9, he's on a walk to go fetch some of these Christians and bring them before authorities, and he's blinded. And he meets Jesus, and everything's changed. He disappears into Arabia for a while. I think he's there getting discipled. You can go read Galatians by Jesus himself. He comes back. He presents himself to the apostles. I don't think they really know what to do with this guy because, hey, you used to kill us. Now you say you're one of us. Finally, Barnabas, the friend, comes along, brings him in. They do the first missionary journey. They get sideways over John Mark. And so Paul teams up in Acts 15 with Silas. They pick up Timothy, a young convert on the way, and now they step into Thessalonica. This is how it goes. Oh, there used to be a screen, but so you can see that the map there, I'll look at it on mine instead. That they start off in this text from Philippi, they go to Amphipolis, Apollonia, Amphipolis, and it seems like just two rather stops. But what you need to know is this journey is about 90 kilometers, or 150 kilometers, about 90 miles. So this is 5 or 6 days, making some pretty good headway on foot. Walking 8, 10, 12 hours a day, perhaps. All right? And they're going to get to Thessalonica, and it's on the Ignatia Way. It's one of the main thoroughfares of Rome. In fact, this is why I love the international church today, because when you look at first century Greek civilization, they had two things going for them. They were all forced to learn Greek language. So everybody spoke a lingua franca. And then Rome had set up these great thoroughfares, these highway systems, so that they could travel back and forth because they proclaimed that we bring peace to the world. And so we create these ways so that we can get there and take care of any disturbances. And today, we have the same thing going. We've got a language. When I was in college, when I first started in college, they said, learn French. I wish I had, because it's still deplorable, as you know, if you speak it with me. But they said it's going to be the international language. It's going to be the language of business. That dates me because that was previous to the internet. And then when the internet came, The lingua franca of the world became English. It's everybody's second language. They say that 1 in 2 people speak English on a daily basis in Europe alone. So we've got this common language. Transportation, it's nothing like the Roman roads. We can get anywhere. You used to, as a missionary, you would put all your stuff in a coffin and ship it to Africa because you weren't coming back. I can't tell you how many times I've flown back and forth over the Atlantic Ocean to do this or that, see a kid or fix this or whatever. We've got communication and transportation together. And so to me, it seems like we have the ideal situation to see revival again. And with the international church, all the nations moving to major cities in the world, churches like this, if we went around the room and asked representation of the nations here today, you would get 20, 30, or 40 on any given Sunday. The time is now. It's a great generation to be part of. It really is. And so, much like in this setting, we see that Thessalonica was like that. It was the capital of Macedonia. It was the major city where all the nations came to and fro. And you're going to see that Paul's going to go in as he normally does. So when they had passed through Amphipolis, Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of Jews. So anytime there were 10 Jewish males in a place, they had to form a synagogue. And so with a major city like this, that would have not been a problem. And Paul would always go in. And a lot of people see this pattern in Paul because he's Jewish, therefore he goes there first, though he's known and called out as the apostle to the Gentiles. And as you'll see here in chapter 17, if you went back a chapter in chapter 16, that's the where he gets thrown in the Philippian jail and released. But you'll see that what it also does, it's not just going to his past historical preference, but it gets the word out quick. Because the Jews were regarded as spiritually superior in many ways. And so Paul, being from Gamaliel, was like, when he came to a city, he was like, oh boy, we've got top-notch teacher, bring him in. And then after 1, 2 Sundays, 3, as we see here in Thessalonica, they're like, why did we let this guy in? And it creates an uproar, because what he's going to do is he's going to do what's really a pretty difficult sermon. He's going to, it says, he's going to reason with them on Sabbath days, on 3 Sabbath days, explaining and proving, verse 3, that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer. If I gave you a Bible right now and said, not the New Testament, just the Old Testament, because that's all he would have had. Show me, prove to me that there's a Messiah who had to come and suffer for our salvation. It'd be interesting, wouldn't it? But if you want to turn to page 448 in your Pew Bible, he probably went to somewhere like this, Psalm 2. And verses 1 to 4. Why do the nations rage and the prophets plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against the Anointed, saying, let us burst these bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. So the nations are screaming out against God that we want freedom. Psalm 2. In verse 4 it says, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds him in derision. I don't think he's laughing in a mocking way. I think it's just laughter because it's kind of like when a 2-year-old comes up and he's going to take you down. You know, it's just not going to happen. I remember I was a camp counselor. This is probably get me in trouble these days. But there was a little 8-year-old came up and he was not going to participate. And he started using language that was not allowable. It was a Christian camp. And so finally, he just kept throwing his fist at me and stuff like that. And maybe this was before I was a dad, but I just reached down and I grabbed him by the ankles and threw him upside down. And I just held him there and looked at him straight in the face. I said, dude, calm down. I know, it's probably child abuse today, but it got his attention because he realized he was up against an immovable force. And so I think that's what God's saying here. But it goes on in verse 7 and 8, I will tell of the decree the Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. And skip down to the end, it says, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. I can see Paul doing this and saying, hey, who is that son? Who is that son? He goes, if you're wondering, flip a few pages or scroll over a few more chapters and get to Psalm 22. Jesus quotes this on the cross, and I think what he's doing, I don't think he's crying out in anguish as much as what rabbis would do at the time. They would point you with the first verse of a psalm to tell you to go remember the big picture of this. So Jesus is hanging on the cross. Paul probably would have used this in teaching. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me, saving from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Go on down to verse 16. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands, my feet. There was no crucifixion in the days of the Psalms. How did he know to write this? I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. That might have been week 2 for Paul. By this time, they're getting a little bit nervous. Week 3 may have come out of Isaiah 53, which you're all familiar with. Surely he has borne our griefs, carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. But he is pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. With his wounds, we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, and we have turned everyone to his own way. Man, I can imagine Paul's application. Israel, you rejected. You like sheep have gone astray. You neglected to receive the King. The one predicted from old who came, you mocked him. You crucified him. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before it shares is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Yeah, Paul just lost his invitation to week 4. He is leading them away from traditional social Judaism. Not the most traditional, not the most biblical. He's trying to press them there. Like Luther during the Reformation, he didn't want a split of the church. He wanted a continuance. He's explaining and proving, verse 3, that it was necessary, back in 1 Thessalonians, for the Christ to suffer, to rise from the dead and say, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. I'm surprised the riot didn't start right then, honestly, if you know what those words meant to those people in that day. Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks. The word there is God-fearer. Okay, a God-fearer is a technical term, actually. It means those who are outside of Israel who come to believe in the God of Israel. Typically, it means they didn't go the final step of circumcision. They rejected the snip at that age, and they said, we want to be part of you, but not that much part of you, okay? And they were allowed into worship at a certain level for certain things, and they were seen as family, but not kind of like a stepbrother or stepsister. But some of those who had been converted to Judaism also followed Paul. And not a few of the leading women. And what he means there by that is women who had wealth. who had power. Seems like at this point in time, everything's going fine. Paul's come in to another city. He's gone to the synagogue. He's preached the message. He's given the gospel. He's done his duty. People are coming to Christ. All is well. But, verse 5, the Jews were jealous and taking some wicked men of the rabble. The rabble there, the word there is agora, it means the marketplace. So they went out to the market and they found some of those guys that you do at even modern day markets, train stations, bus stations. They kind of hang around and they look for opportunity to take advantage of. And they went and got these type of guys. And they said, hey, and you can imagine, here's the high and mighty Jew, leaders of the synagogue, coming to the rabble men, who would usually, probably they'd cross the street not to be on the same side of the street of them. They would never talk to them. And yet here they're saying, hey, we need your help. We'll probably even pay you for this, but we need a crowd to create a noise about something that's really going wrong here. This man's come in and he's telling this heretical thought, and we need to put it to a stop now. And so they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. They couldn't find him, though. I want to know what happened. Did Paul and Silas learn from Philippi when the crowd goes wild, you better disappear, because otherwise you're going to jail? I don't know. But they weren't there. They dragged Jason because he was hosting them. Jason was therefore probably a well-to-do. He had his own house. Some people suppose that Paul was even, because it's going to say that he was working later in 1 Thessalonians. He's going to say that he worked while he was there. So maybe at Jason's shop. But they bring Jason and some of the other brothers, so people who have gone into this church setting, shouting, these men, and they use a word that's used elsewhere in the Bible, have turned the world upside down. And I always think about that because sometimes we look at the news, we've been praying for over a year about the Ukraine situation with an earthquake in Turkey recently, and we look at those things, and I always warn you, if you're going to go read the news online or watch the news, you need to do it in a posture of prayer, because otherwise you're going to have a hardened heart. If you just flip web pages and you see this bad thing and that bad thing and this bad thing, and you just keep on going and it doesn't emote, doesn't affect you, then you're training yourself for that. So get on your knees when you're doing news. Knees, news. News, knees. Because you need to be praying through that stuff. Because you're receiving high intensity volumes of emotive things and you're deadening to it. Pray through it, okay? And these guys turned the world upside down. 11 back then. We got more than that here. I would suppose that we should also be turning the world upside down. Jason received them. They're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another King Jesus. There would have been two complaints here, two things that they were breaking. Remember, I said that part of Rome, their big deal was we bring peace, Pax Romana. If you know anything, if you passed any history lesson of that age, ever, Pax Romana, okay? That they bring peace. And a disturbance was seen as, hey, we need to send bigger, stronger authority. Thessalonica had a place, they had a home rule set up in their city, that they had been given special privileges because they had kind of a group of people that would oversee and rule the city, and they did it well, so Rome kind of let them have their space. But if a disturbance came up, they could lose that privilege. So creating a disturbance was a bad deal. But second, Caesar at this time was probably in his 70s. Tiberius had already made a law that you can't prophesy, you can't predict, you can't say anything about who the next Caesar will be. Because he was a little scared. He's 70-something, that's pretty old in that day. And so they're already kind of looking beyond him. And so it was pretty tense to even speak about the subject. And yet, they were saying, there's another king. And he's here for you to receive now. and you can be part of his kingdom, which is a bigger, better kingdom than anything Rome has to offer you. So those would have been the two strikes. And the people in the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. When they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. It's hard to know what exactly was going on here, but some kind of bond was posted to release Jason and the brothers. And it probably had a promise that said, and these guys won't do this again. Paul speaks later about not being able to come back here because Satan has kind of gotten in the way. And I don't know if this deal was part of that or what. But if they come back, Jason and the brothers will suffer. It's one thing for Paul. You'll see him walk back into a stoning. Hit me again. But when it involves other people, he seems a little less likely. And so they had bailed out themselves. Jason probably put up the security. And they were released, but don't let this happen again. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. So this is another 40 miles away. Paul repeats it. And this is why I think I'm not so sure Paul was doing this pattern because he was going to the Jews first because he was a Jew. Part of the reason. But I think he also knew that this was the best amplification of the message, good or bad. Good news, people come to Christ. Bad news, people hear about it. And they will either come or they will reject, but they hear. We were sailing in Croatia last week, first vacation that I can remember where I wasn't doing something that was work-oriented or whatever in maybe 20 years. And it was so nice to unplug. But we were going up and down the coast of Croatia in the sailboat that Patrick was sailing for us. And I would get into these, and this is how my mind thinks, we would pull into these little places where there was a village. And I'm studying Thessalonians, while we're out there. And I'm like, how long would it take Paul to create an uproar here? What would he do? And I'd see a church steeple. I say, okay, we'd go to the Catholic church there. We could make a mess. Probably they'd make us get back on the boat. But how would it work? How would I do this today? How do we do it in St. Paul? How do we reach the Côte d'Azur? How do we make such an uproar that people will come? And I'm not saying be anti-government. Maybe we're anti-culture. Maybe we just love people no matter what, and that kind of freaks them out, and they want to know what's going on there. Maybe we don't take up the usual, hospitalities of whatever culture we're in, but we overcome those with kindness, with goodness, with love. And we show a respect that it's not due because of how they're acting as a human. It's due because of who they are in creation. And that we start seeing souls instead of a personality that's been misled and deceived for so many years that they're deformed in many ways. Without this truth, how can you be anything like Jesus? And if you just kind of fall into it, it's typically there's a moral code that was invested in you somewhere that you got it. And it's based on what Jesus did. But let them see what it was. How can we do today what they were doing 2,000 years ago? The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away to Berea, and when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. These Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. That's not hard to say, I guess, if they're trying to stone you at one place. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And this text is quoted often, and I'll quote it here, but you need to use this text to confer that what I say is what is real. You need to be not coming in here and just letting my words enter into your ears and into your brain. You need to. That's why we set Pew Bibles out. That's why we tell you to open your devices. That's why sometimes I don't even put the words of the text on the screen, because I want you looking at it. The best thing I can do for you is give you his word. I know I've shared this story before, but my pastor, he's back home. All he knew how to do was teach. He's almost socially inept. We'll have to erase that from the text. But he is. All he knows, I've been driving in the car with him, and he just flat out goes through red lights because he's preaching to me. One time, I remember it was on University in Bonnie Bray, and he goes, "Hey, James, what'd you think about Romans 6? Boom, right through a red light. And I'm like, dude, I'd like to hear Romans 7. But you need to be like these people. Get in your word. It is the cure. And you know what? You may say, been there, done that, tried that, doesn't work. No, that's a lie. It works. Persevere. Submit to it. Get in fellowship around it. Discover its true essence. Not with some guys yelling at that you're going to go to hell unless you do this. There's some truth, but you need all the truth, not just part of it. Be people of the word. Be Bereans, like Acts 17. Many of them, therefore, believed, with not a few Greek women as high standing as well as men. But then when the Jews from Thessalonica, 40 miles away, this took them 2 days to walk, maybe a little less if they had some horses. But they learned somehow that Paul had gone to Berea, and now what had happened in Thessalonica is now happening there. I mean, if you heard that there was a heresy in Cannes, would you get in your car and go over there and fix it today? Or would you just read about it and keep on going? These guys got up to go change it. And they came there to Paul and Berea, agitating the crowd. So many of them therefore believed, just like in Thessalonica. But then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, so he goes on down the coast. He's eventually going to go over to Corinth. And after receiving a command, Silas and Timothy come to him. But from Athens, he sends them back out because he heard that maybe Thessalonica wasn't doing so well. So Timothy actually goes back to Thessalonians, the Thessalonian church. And then when we see him in Corinth, he receives Timothy back with word. And I think it's 1 Thess 3:6. But it says, and then Timothy came to us and he brought good news. And that's the setting for Thessalonians. He's sitting in Corinth early on in the second missionary journey. They've been forced to leave. He's moving along, doing his thing, but he's thinking about them continuously. In fact, it's going to say, Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy, to the church of the Thessalonians, in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, grace to you and peace. And it's going to go on, and Brad will open this up for you next week. But I remember you always in my prayers. That there's something in Paul, the guy who used to persecute Christians, now being run out of town for being a Christian and hating it. Hating it. I've had righteous anger, maybe 2 times, 3 in my life that I can actually say, hey, I think I'm angry and it's okay. Usually I'm just angry and it's not okay. But the first time was when I was teaching in Iraq, and it was early on during kind of the tumultuous times there. And we had a girl and a couple guys that were from Mosul, and Mosul was a place that was just bad news. And we were taking them home. And so we stopped the car, and I had to get out at a tea room, and they took them in, and they said, hey, we're going to drop them off in Mosul. You got to stay here. And I'm like, what for? And they said, because you could get in with an American passport, but you're not going to get out. And he said, especially if they find out you're a Christian. And I remember standing there, sipping tea in a really bad mood, thinking, Jesus made that place. Jesus has the right to go there. But I trusted my guides, trusted that the 3 that were going there would do the job. And I imagine Paul sitting in Corinth, thinking about being forced out of Thessalonica, being forced out of Berea, stoned here, jailed there, that there was a righteous anger in him. Okay, I can't go. What can I do? Bring me some parchment, led by the Spirit. Take this down, written by an amanuensis. I, Paul, Silvanus and Timothy, to the church of Thessalonica. It's a church that sits in the middle of transportation. It's a church that has a common language. It's a church that struggles with sexual issues, authority issues, with being in a government that doesn't believe issues, in conflict within issues. It's a church just like St. Paul. And over the next 8, 10, 12 weeks, we're going to look at this and try to learn the lessons that God has for us so that we can be like Paul, like Silvanus, like Timothy, those who teach, who educate, those who put their lives out there for the sake of the one truth that's worthy of standing on.